Like Roger, many of us have our own stories of difficulties we encountered in faith communities, difficulties that probably often arose out of some of those same terrible controversies that Roger talked about, and out of the growing pains of our own personal lives. But I also hope we have our own aspirations, like the one that Roger pointed to, of being part of community dedicated to the hard work of social change towards justice and compassion. Both of those aspects are reminders that even the traditions and the institutions that seem most resistant to evolution, to changing, are, in the Buddha's words, inconstant, impermanent, and subject to change. And that holds out the possibility, but we have to remember, not the guarantee, that things can improve. But things can go wrong. We can actually make matters worse. And so that's why we want to move to this question of, okay, so how can we move forward in a way that's positive? The ability of people, institutions, and cultures to change in the ways that do increase well-being and justice will continue to be tested in the crucible of the ongoing struggles to dismantle oppressive structures in our societies. If successful, I think it will be a struggle that moves us towards ecological sustainability and climate justice, resource distribution and economic justice, and collective liberation and social justice. I'd also like to say that religions that aren't doing this are not only outdated, they're dangerous. Yeah. That being the case, I'd like to remember 4 interconnected approaches that may be useful in our common struggle. The first is critical theory, providing opportunities to one another to expose, understand, and subvert oppressive structures and cultures, including our own roles as those who suffer injustice and those who inflict or benefit from injustice. The second is reflexive practice, teaching and modeling tools that integrate that critical reflection with mindful action in a cycle of emergent strategy. The third is cultivating local community, transforming how we relate to one another so that we nurture wholeness instead of oppression in our relationships with each other and with the earth. And 4, joining in, participating in, supporting larger movements, connecting folks with resources, organizations, and actions from around the world that empower them to act in meaningful and effective ways. The beginning, I think, has to be with this first one, with critical theory, because we can't just blunder around. That's what religions are famous for doing, is just kind of, going and stepping in it right immediately. So I'm not suggesting that we have to do all these things or only these things, but that we start with something like critical theory, because when it comes to exposing, understanding, and subverting oppressive systems and culture, a key principle is that rather than making us feel bad about ourselves and wallowing in self-guilt, understanding our roles in oppressive systems should be understood as an opportunity to learn, to take responsibility, and to join the work of creating a just and peaceful world. Growing up in Southwest Missouri, you won't be surprised to know I was surrounded by racism, sexism, nationalism, phobias of divergent genders and sexualities, and more. And I didn't escape that conditioning. But I did have experiences that made me keenly aware that oppression was at work, that it was socially permissible to mistreat certain people in certain situations, and that sometimes I was one of those people. As I grew up, I found helpful and hopeful examples in the teachings and lives of Jesus and the prophets, and then in that history of courageous people who stood up against injustice. I'm also nurtured by liberation theologians, biblical scholars, historians, anthropologists, and others whose works help me understand and whose lives often model how faith communities can subvert injustice and replace them with new habits and attitudes that embody compassion, wisdom, and equality. For most of us, undoing the conditioning we inevitably receive by virtue of living in a violent, oppressive world is the ongoing work of a lifetime. We don't finish and get to stop. So taking what is best from prophetic traditions and combining it with the insights born of movements such as intersectional feminism and critical social theory, faith communities can create a much-needed place where we can learn these lessons while causing a minimal amount of harm to others. These traditions invite us to honestly face tough questions. So we aren't asking ourselves merely to make adjustments to our lifestyles, changing light bulbs and buying fair trade shoes and coffee, and then never thinking about anything again. We can do those things. I'd say we should do those things, but not without also grappling with how oppressive cultures have sunk deep into our psyches. As a white person, in what ways do I continue to benefit from white supremacy, even if I don't harbor prejudice, even if I don't like it? And what am I going to do about it? As a working class person, how do I deal with the demonization of the poor, and how has that impacted my ideas and actions? Even as a bisexual and genderqueer person, how do I deal with and heal from the biphobia and misogyny that was planted within me? Critical theory plunges us into our hidden assumptions across the issues so that we can understand not just how the system works, but how we can work against the system. For me, this also reclaims the concepts of repentance and conversion, moving those concepts into the present day in ways that can be helpful to us. Of particular help these last few years has been my participation in the Order of Ecumenical Franciscans, a diverse group of folk from around the world who are committed to individually and collectively be in the forefront of promoting justice by testimony of our human lives and courageous initiatives. In my personal Franciscan rule of life, the traditional heading of penitence is transformed. It becomes an aspiration to seek to better understand my own position within systems and cultures of oppression, to acknowledge my complicity as a person who participates in, even unintentionally, and benefits from those sins, and commit to not only confessing these sins, but to working for true and lasting healing and transformation. And I hope you can see there, too, the update of what is sin. Something that we feel guilty about, or a realization of how we're complicit in systems and structures and cultures of oppression. That's a definition of sin that's actually helpful to me. It doesn't beat me over the head, but that invites me into something new, into something wonderful. I'm repenting of internalized dominance. I'm healing from internalized oppression. And it's in this way that I think anti-oppression work is a spiritual practice. This perspective means that offering education, training, and accountability in reflexive practices goes hand in hand with understanding and subverting injustice. Contemplative and reflexive tools have long held a central place in religious traditions, and I think they offer the best possibility for building the self-correction that Roger mentioned into our religious cultures. But too often, people have used contemplative tools to just accommodate themselves to injustice, to become merely patient without simultaneously working for change, to alleviate personal feelings of stress while escaping responsibility for this world. In contrast, the integration of critical reflection with mindful action provides a pathway to understand whether our religious practices are adaptive or not, by uncovering our hidden assumptions and theories of change, by alerting us to the role social contexts play in our failures and successes, and by giving us a chance to make informed choices for strategic action. We don't just do the hard work that critical theory initiates. We don't stop with the critical reflection. We integrate it together with mindful action, using critical theory to inform our actions and letting our actions deepen our understanding and application of critical theory. My own spiritual pathways have been most influenced in this regard by engaged Buddhism and Quaker peace building. My work in Cambodia, through support from the Mennonite Central Committee, immersed me in this interfaith world where Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and humanists all work together to tackle really difficult and intractable social problems, from land grabbing to deforestation to domestic violence. The Venerable Luang Savat, a Buddhist monk, worked with human rights organizations to offer retreats at a Jesuit center to help victims of violent eviction heal and plan their next steps of resistance. John McConnell, a Quaker, provided workshops on using meditation as a tool to more effectively deal with conflict and anxiety, two stressors that often exhausted our organizers and activists. Peace Bridges worked with village chiefs, prison guards, Muslim imams, Christian missionaries, and countless others to provide training and services in peace skills. Holly and I joined in, working with people from diverse backgrounds from Cambodia and around the world to teach skills in mindfulness and conflict transformation. Not only did all of this provide tools and opportunities for self-correction, it increased resilience and sustainability of the workers and the work. I'm deeply grateful to have worked and learned alongside these innovative and incredible peace builders. And you notice that as we work together, it brings us to a third pathway that's also prominent in religious traditions, and that's building community. Each generation has to reimagine community in response to the issues and needs of their times. My own sense is that the most pressing questions of today are the interdependent ones I mentioned earlier: ecological sustainability and climate justice, resource distribution and economic justice, and collective liberation and social justice. Cultivating community is hard work, especially in a society like the USA that provides easy and alluring substitutes that ultimately don't have the same potential for bringing about lasting and true social change, that leave us unsatisfied with regard to our psychosocial needs and make us vulnerable to those who manipulate us based on unfulfilled longings. In a recent interview, Naomi Klein repeated her advice on opposing the Trump administration and then added this important insight. She said, "But what about the next brand name billionaire candidate out to leverage consumer relationships into votes? Ultimately, little will change until we stop buying what lifestyle brands are selling. And that means we'll have to form our identity based on what we do and what we believe, not on what we buy." Amen. It may sound like an un-American idea, she closed, but perhaps its time has come. In this sense, community, coming together, learning to relate together, is an antidote to consumerism, an aspect of oppressive systems that we often overlook. Injustice relies on objectification and commodification of people and the animate and inanimate world. Community can help us heal from this commodification while we learn how to live together in just, wise, and compassionate ways. We have a strong history to draw upon here, especially through the practice of radical hospitality. We have to ask questions of ourselves like, who feels comfortable coming to our church and why? Who feels uncomfortable coming to our church and why? How do we get to know one another? How do we extend care to one another? How do we deal with differences and conflict? What are we doing to express care for the earth? What strengths can we celebrate and use to grow stronger together? And finally, faith communities can also become hubs for community organizing, helping connect people with one another and to an unfolding network of resources, organizations, and actions. Whereas community building focuses more on our interpersonal relationships with one another and can create a sustainable base from which to act, participating in larger movements focuses more on those structural relationships and can link us to issues and organizations near and far. I'm going to talk more about this at our conference, I think, but it's important to emphasize that we are living witnesses to some of the most important social movements in U.S. history. In this context, we can empower each other to embody our convictions in meaningful and effective ways, from divesting in coal to fighting for $15 of the minimum wage raise, to supporting Black Lives Matter, now celebrating its 4th year of incredible work. Our struggles toward a sustainable and just society are intimately and integrally connected. Our mutual support of one another arise out of and are strengthened by this insight. An emphasis on these kinds of strategies requires a reformation of approach for many religious communities. As Richard Rohr put it, we must move from a belief-based spirituality to a practice-based spirituality, or little will change in religion, politics, and the world. This is the kind of shift that can help us make better use of the tools and insights religious traditions can provide, so that we can more effectively move in the direction of collective liberation. There's nothing new in any of this, perhaps, except for the newness we experience when these practices reach our own lives in our own times, except for the new insights that arise when we dare to think and act critically, mindfully, justly, and compassionately, except for the renewed relationships that await our work for justice, except for the new air we breathe into our world when we not only talk about reforming religion, but make the continual effort to do it.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.